Hey, sister friends, it's Carrie Robaina here, host of She Walks in Truth. And on today's episode, you're going to be hearing from Jenn Baxter, who is an accomplished author, speaker, and freelance writer. Her book, Live a Fast Life, is based on her own experiences with clean living and downsizing into a 160 square foot tiny house on wheels. She now teaches others how to make similar changes in their own lives. She loves the Lord, and I'm excited for you to hear from her today. Stay tuned.
You're listening to the She Walks in Truth podcast with Carrie Robaina. Each week, she brings an inspiring message or story to help equip women to walk in the fullness of their identity in Christ. Real women, real stories, and a very real God.
Jenn, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is a real pleasure to have you on, and I can't wait for my guests to get to know you and to hear about the book that you just published and, of course, your testimony and your journey and how God is using you in so many different ways on your blog, as an author, and as a speaker. And before we go into some of those details of your life and the way that He's using you and the conversations that you're having with other women these days, can you briefly share with us your faith journey and your journey with the Lord and how you came to know Him?
Oh, sure. It's hard to abbreviate it because I feel like it's been such a rich, long journey. But I was saved when I was 27. So really when I was younger, I was brought up Catholic and I went to church, but I feel like there was no relationship there with God whatsoever. And I would totally just phase out while I was at church. I would think about other things, and even just kind of right before I was saved, even in my mid-20s, my mom would still come to my apartment and pick me up and drag me off to church. And I'd be like, can't we just go have lunch? Like, I was just not interested at all. And then really, it was kind of an interesting way that it came about that I was saved, because I wasn't seeking at all. I didn't really have any clue that I was even lost. I just was going through my daily life. And I ended up working at this home builder. And while I was at the home builder, someone that I worked with started just speaking to me, just intermittently, about God. And for the first time, I realized that I was actually open to it, and I was actually receiving what this person was saying. And then at the same time, I hired an assistant, and the assistant that I chose myself and that I hired started talking about this book called The Purpose-Driven Life. And I had never heard of it. I had no idea what it was. And she just kept talking about it to the point where eventually I was so curious that I was like, I'm going to do this book. And I asked my mom to do it with me. And as I was reading the book, the best way I can describe it is I felt like I was reading things that I already knew somewhere in my spirit, but I had forgotten. And I was like being reminded of things that I already knew. So that's kind of just how the journey started. I literally prayed for salvation one night by myself in a cabin on a cruise ship, because I went on a vacation with a girlfriend of mine while I was reading the book, and I was determined that I was not going to miss a day of this journey. So I kept doing it even on the cruise, and just prayed by myself one night in the cabin. And, things really just kind of picked up from there. And I had that excitement of a new Christian, and went and found a church to belong to, started volunteering, was just very excited. And then of course life happened. And I got into a relationship that ended up being abusive, but it was just a very dysfunctional, all-consuming relationship. And so that really kind of took me away from God for a few years. And I still knew He was there, but I think I was intentionally kind of keeping the distance there because I knew I was doing something He didn't want me to do. And so that did take me away for a couple of years. When I finally left that relationship in 2011, that's when He really pulled me back in tight. I feel like that's when I got baptized. That's when all the interior work started in me. And I really feel like that is when I really would pinpoint and say, that's when my relationship with God really started, because that's when I started learning to just run to Him for everything and ask Him everything and surrender everything to Him. And I was in the middle of some health struggles at that time. So it was really almost divinely arranged, because I think He needed me to be able to slow down, to be able to actually get to that point where I could speak to Him. So that's kind of been where my journey has been just over the past 4 years or so.
Wow. And it's just like God to meet us right where we're at in just the right moment. And one thing that I really love about your story, and that I believe it's going to help listeners with today, is to know that you committed to, first of all, to reading that book and to learning more about the Lord, and also that he meets us where we're at. And I think one of the Lord's favorite words has to be come, like come to me. And so it doesn't have to be in the midst of some big church service or anywhere. You were on a cruise ship, right? In the middle of the ocean, in your cabin, crying out to God, and he met you in that place. That's so beautiful. I know that with your story, you are very passionate about helping women simplify their lives. And as I looked more into the book that you wrote and what you speak about, it's more than just simplifying one aspect of your life. It's the spiritual, the emotional, and even the physical space. Has your testimony been the cause of you to want to help other people, other women simplify their lives, or how did that all come about?
It all tied together for me. It was definitely sort of all happening at the same time. And what was interesting is I had just gone through this string of really traumatic things, just back to back to back. And I went through the abusive relationship, and then that finally ended. And literally the same month that it ended, my father passed away. And my father and he was my fiance. So my father and my fiance were very similar. My father was never physically abusive, but he was emotionally abusive. He was a very angry person. And my fiance at the time, he just sort of mirrored that. So that was a tremendous loss to lose that relationship and my father at the exact same time. And then I was also working an extremely toxic job at the same time. Then when I just started to get back up on my feet, then my mother got sick, she was my very, very best friend. And then she passed away, and my health just took a nosedive from all of this stuff happening. And it ended up being advanced adrenal fatigue, which basically was just that my body got stuck in the fight or flight mode, basically, is the short way of saying what that is. And at that point, I felt like, oh my gosh, all these things have been taken from me. I've experienced all this loss. And I had no idea, though, that was actually, I feel like, the beginning of God stripping down my life, because I had lost these things that were important to me in my life, but I still was bogged down by a lot of just clutter. And I just feel like he literally reached out and got a hold of me in that moment. And instead of me spiraling downward and becoming depressed and just closing myself off, it was like he literally just grabbed a hold of me and was like, I'm going to start getting rid of all the excess stuff in your life, all of it. I'm going to strip you down and prune you, as much as I possibly can. So for me, it felt like all these things were related. And the first part of it was that I really felt him drawing me to a simpler life physically, as in actual getting rid of physical clutter. And I was no different than most people in America. I think most middle class to upper class people in America, I just had a lot of stuff for one person. And I felt him calling me to this simpler life. I got rid of about 80% of my belongings. I did a really extreme version because I ended up moving into a tiny house on wheels. So
wow.
I was living in 160 square feet. But so I got rid of a lot of this physical clutter. But what I ended up finding in my own process was, as I was getting rid of this physical clutter, it was bringing up emotional clutter and spiritual clutter, because these things that I had held on to represented all of these different emotions and these different beliefs that I had about myself and about life and about other people. So I was being forced to address this emotional baggage as I was getting rid of the physical clutter. So that's how those two tied together. And then at the same time, I was addressing my adrenal fatigue. And really, the only way you can address that is just through lifestyle changes. And I needed to start letting go of stress. I needed to let go of, repressed emotions. I needed to take time to be peaceful every day and take time to make sure I was in bed on time and eating properly and everything. So that tied again into getting rid of the physical clutter and letting go of the emotional clutter. So really, I felt like it all just tied together to me, which is sort of where my brand has come from, the blog, the book, because it's just about stripping, I call it stripping down and cleaning up your life, but it really is just getting rid of all the excess stuff, the clutter, the toxic stuff, the emotional baggage, so that you can really kind of get down to who God created you to be and who you've been kind of underneath all of that stuff the whole time.
I agree with you of like the clutter part physically too. And I cannot function if I have tons of clutter. And you walk into my house, like we've lived in our home for 6 years, and I still don't have a couch in one of our front living rooms when you walk into the home, because I don't know, it's really simple. And even in my office, I just recently had to redo that because I was feeling cramped, and I found that I didn't even want to be in the space and not even come in here as my war room and my prayer room. And so I realized, wow, that's the space that God also carved out for me to go pray as well. And so it's like somehow, I'm sure like there's some spiritual stuff attached to that and emotional. It was like I almost felt kicked out of my own office, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. Because actually, one of the first things that I teach people when I'm helping them with decluttering is I say, this sounds like a funny first step or a funny rule, but I always say you have to give yourself permission, because people don't realize they're the only one that is really standing in the way of them getting rid of this stuff. But for some reason, it's gotten to that point where we are the only ones that are sort of holding ourselves prisoner to this stuff. So the very first step you have to take is give yourself permission that it's okay to let go of this stuff. And it's especially, of course, difficult with sentimental stuff. And I'm an extremely sentimental person myself. So I had probably 6 of those big Rubbermaid containers of mementos in just every form, just school papers and letters and Halloween costumes and my graduation gown and a prom gown, just everything. But when it came down to it, when I had to move into 160 square feet, I didn't have the luxury of keeping, most of that stuff. But when it came down to it, I just thought, like, what am I going to do with this graduation gown? Like, truthfully, what am I going to do with this? So I had to just give myself permission to let go of those things and know that I still have the memories of my graduation. I still have the memories of prom. I still, all of that is inside of me. Those are just physical objects. And, heaven forbid, if something happened where I had a fire or I had a flood, I would have lost those things anyway. And I would have still had the memories. So I really was able to finally sort of detach and realize that the emotions were separate from the objects. And it didn't happen right away. It was definitely a process. And when my mom passed away, initially, I just wanted to keep everything that I could of hers, just books and clothes and knickknacks and everything, because it was hers. And I was still very raw from the loss. But then as I really let myself go through the process, really let myself feel the grief and work through it, then I was able to look at those things more objectively. And then it was like, okay, well, I can keep the things that really do have meaning between her and I, but then I can get rid of random books that she owned or a sweatshirt that she owned because it really wasn't important to me. And then I could focus more on the things that were important to me.
That is great. You make a great point there that emotions are separate from the things. That is tweetable. So if you guys are, that brings freedom right there. And I lost my mom when I was 20 years old. I'm almost 43 now. And I was the same way. I wanted to keep everything of hers. And what's most precious to me is her little recipe box and a picture of her, and the memories that I have, and just a couple things like that I put on my Christmas tree remind me of her. And it was just a matter of being able to let go when I was able to fully process the emotional stuff as well. And in some ways I felt like holding on to that stuff. And if I would see a lot of the tubs, I had Rubbermaid tubs as well, that it would, I don't know, somehow it would just take me back to the emotions, and I would almost like find myself getting depressed a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I feel like I'm just now, and I'm 40 years old too. So I feel like I'm just now starting to understand what he means when he says, the yoke should be easy and the burden should be light, is that like, I didn't realize that I was holding myself back by all of that stuff, because people will say, well, isn't it just clutter? And I'm like, no, it's not just clutter, because the clutter is just a physical representation of what's going on inside of you. So I didn't realize that I wasn't going to be able to do all of these big plans that God has for me. And he wasn't going to be able to use me in the way he wants to use me until I cleared all of this other stuff out. He was literally like cleaning house, because he's like, come on, I got big plans for you. And, I can't really use you to the extent that I want to use you if you're insistent on dragging all of this stuff with you from the past. And it wasn't even, a lot of it wasn't even stuff that I necessarily consciously knew I was stuffing inside. But then when he started to sort of reveal all of that to me, then I realized, oh, wow, there's some stuff in here since childhood that I didn't realize I was holding on to. And it did literally feel like I was becoming lighter as he was working me through these things. And, I always tell people it's not necessarily a fun process. I'm not going to lie and sugarcoat it. It's not always sunshine and rainbows. And I had some pretty tough days, but the freedom that I feel on the other side of it is you can't put a value on that. So I tried to, encourage people, even though it's difficult, really kind of let yourself get in the muck and feel it and process through it. And you're not alone. I mean, God is there to walk you through it. He's holding your hand the entire time, and just let yourself go through that, bring everything up and out, and, let him use you like he created you to be used.
Amen. That is great. And I'm curious, as I'm sure some of my listeners are, how did the tiny house on wheels? I just want to know, how did that all come about? Because I've seen pictures of those and I am just like, wow, that looks amazing. So was that part of your story as well, and God working at you, or how did that part come about?
I do pet sitting and house sitting. And so I was house sitting for a friend, and she didn't have cable. So I was just scrolling through Netflix, trying to find something to watch. And I came upon this documentary that was called Tiny. And it was about this couple that built a tiny house. And this is back in 2014. So tiny houses weren't really as big as what they are now. And I really had no concept of it. I had never heard of it. I didn't know what it was. I just thought, oh, this sounds interesting. And so I put the movie on. And by the end of the 90 minutes or whatever it was, my heart was just racing. And I was like, this is what I am supposed to do. Because I already was sort of feeling that call a little bit to that simpler life, but I also have never really been somebody that was very much into designer labels or having the latest gadgets or anything. I've never really been into that stuff. And I thought, this is perfect. And my mom had left me a very small, modest amount of money when she passed away. And I was thinking I was going to put that as a down payment on a condo or a townhouse. And here I realized I could use the exact same amount of money and buy a tiny house outright and be mortgage-free, rent-free. And I thought, what better way for me to pay tribute to her and do a wonderful thing with this amount of money that she left me, that I could pay off my credit cards, I could buy my car outright, I could buy this tiny house, and I could pretty much live almost debt-free, other than just paying utilities and things like that. So that's kind of where it came from. And then things really just picked up quickly. I ended up being on the television show, the Tiny House television show on HGTV. And it ended up, I won't get into the whole story because it's a long story, but unfortunately it ended up where I ended up having to move out of my tiny house because the builder that I chose didn't really exactly know what he was doing. And he talked a really good game, but sort of got in over his head. I don't think he had any malicious intentions. I think he literally just got in over his head. And I only was able to live there for about 5 months, and then it was falling apart around me. So I actually did get my money back, which is a huge blessing because that doesn't always happen. And I can already see, even just looking back on it, all the blessings that came from that situation. He definitely learned a lesson. He reached out to me. He gave me a very humble apology afterwards. I learned a lot from it. So it's definitely, I think, just a part of the plan and a part of the journey. I still absolutely love the lifestyle, and I plan on doing another tiny house. I don't know if it's going to be 160 square feet again. It might be a tiny bit bigger than that, but still small.
That is awesome. That is so great. I love that. Tell me a little bit about your book. It is called Live a Fast Life. Mm-hmm. And if you can tell my listeners the premise of the book, it's probably similar to what we're talking about.
Yeah, FAST actually stands for fabulous, abundant, simple, and tiny. And that really just came from the idea that I wanted people to understand that simplifying your life, or even going as far as tiny, did not mean deprivation. It doesn't mean depriving yourself and being miserable, that it was actually quite the opposite, that the more I simplified my life, the more fabulous and abundant it became. So that's where Live a Fast Life came from. And that's also the name of my blog. But when I really felt God pushing me to write this book and to share my story, it was only logical, I felt like, to just call it the same thing, because the story, in fact, even the subtitle of the book, is How Stripping Down and Cleaning Up Gave Me My Life Back. Wow. So it's really just, it's part memoir, part help guide. And I don't like to say self-help because it's not me doing it. It's all God doing it. I always just say help book, not self-help. But the first part of the book tells my story, and it really gets into some pretty vulnerable stuff. But I feel like, I want to be vulnerable with my readers. I want to share that stuff because there's people out there that can relate to everything I've been through, or bits and pieces of it. So it tells my story. And then about probably halfway through, it starts telling the story of the changes that God made in my life and how he simplified it. But it also gives practical tips so that the reader can start making some of those changes as well.
So it sounds like it's a book that's, as you were talking about earlier, the first step is giving ourselves permission to be able to let go. And it seems like this book is written with that intent, with intention, yes. And, helping people understand that that is the first step.
Yes. And I feel like I always refer to it as the blinders being taken off. I feel like when my mother passed away, that my eyes were opened in this new way. And to me, it just felt like I started to finally see life how I was supposed to have been living it this entire time. But we all just get very distracted and just we almost fall into this routine that we don't even realize we're in. And we're like running this race that we never signed up to run, but we just get caught in it. And we're just caught up in, getting more stuff and having more stuff and working these long hours at these jobs to have that stuff, and just eating whatever is most convenient, and not really paying attention to even like what products we're using on our bodies and around the house. And we don't have time to deal with emotions. So we just stuff the emotions and then we just keep going. And it's like all these things just sort of play in together. And I just literally felt like he just took these blinders off of me and let me see all of that, so that not only I could change it in my own life, but that I could start telling other people about it and sort of giving them a little bit of a shake that hopefully maybe they can realize, like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that I was doing this, but this is true. And then I don't want to live this way anymore, and start making some changes.
One thing that we didn't really touch on was the adrenal fatigue, that part of the physical aspect of our lives. And I had recovered from adrenal fatigue a couple years ago too. And it was a tough type of recovery process, and realizing that I needed to pay attention more to even things I was putting on my skin, or the things that I was breathing in or putting in my house, and how maybe it was impacting my kids as well.
Right.
And would you say, from your experience, when you're in a spot, and I've had other health issues as well, but when you're in a spot when you don't have your health, you become vulnerable. You said that as part of your testimony in the beginning part. It's like everything's stripped away and all you really have is the Lord. And so in a way, it's a blessing, even though it's hard to go through. But I think of being able to know the Lord in new and different ways, and my faith as well, had I not gone through those. Has that been your experience too?
Yeah, definitely. And I have actually said that to friends of mine before, where I say, I'm not going to say that he necessarily caused the adrenal fatigue, but he certainly let it happen, because it slowed me down and it got me to the point where I had to stop and address these things. And, I've always been somebody, I guess, that I wouldn't call myself a type A personality necessarily, but I am a control freak, and I like to, have control and know what's happening. And I really just was kind of going. And I was just doing all of these things that I wanted to do. And he really just slowed me down and got me to start paying attention to all these things that I was not paying attention to. And the adrenal fatigue itself, I know, came from that string of events that I went through, because my body just literally never got a break. And it was just every time that I thought, okay, I can come up for air, something else happened and I just went back under again. But within that, I realized I had been doing a terrible job of, maintaining a healthy diet. I was eating awful, like processed foods and just tons of sugar and, hardly any fresh vegetables. And I wasn't paying any attention to the products I used whatsoever, which I think is actually pretty common. I think most people just sort of assume if it's on the shelf, it's safe. And that is so not the case. And then even just not sleeping properly, not really taking time during the day to have quiet time and to have time with God. And I wasn't doing any of those things. So through the tool, I guess you could say, of adrenal fatigue, he got me to pay attention to all of these different things. And as I started to put better things in my body, then my body started to feel better. And then I was able to do more things because I wasn't feeling sick all the time. And I was always just kind of a very sickly person. And thankfully, I never had anything really seriously wrong with me, but I always got lots of colds and lots of flus, and they would turn into bronchitis. And I had a very sensitive stomach, and I was kind of a sickly person for overall being in generally good health. And when I changed my diet, it was like night and day. I mean, it was just so different. And even that, to me, the way I describe it to people is I always say, I feel like God just sort of showed me, like, this is creation. This is what I created. I created the plants. I did create the animals, and this is the world I created. And then there's all this stuff outside of that. There's all of this stuff that man created, all of this crazy stuff. And I don't need you to worry about any of that. Just try to get as close as you can back to the way I created things. And so that's kind of my general outlook, even just for my diet. And I try to stay with as natural as I can, I'm not a vegetarian. I still eat meat, but I try to eat clean meats that haven't been pumped full of all kinds of chemicals. I try to buy from local farmers who literally could stand there and talk to me about how they farmed and how they raised their animals. I try to eat fresh vegetables. I am gluten-free just because I, in particular, need to do that for my stomach. I can't handle gluten, but, just kind of basic common sense stuff. It's not even that I'm like trying to create some fad diet or something that I think people need to follow. It's literally just getting back to simple stuff. And same thing, even with my products that I use. I try not to use things that are just laden with all these words that you can't even pronounce on the back, when you can literally use things like vinegar and baking soda and lemon juice and clean your whole house. Like, it just kind of makes common sense. It's just that same kind of thing where it's like, it's almost stuff that we already know, but we're just not really paying attention to it, if that makes sense.
It totally does. And do you touch on that in your book?
I do.
So Jenn, what is one encouragement that you would leave my listeners with today, our sisters in Christ?
I think the thing that I feel like he's really laid on my heart is just to remember that he is with you every step of the way. I think a lot of times when we think about making any kind of life change, whether it's about just decluttering your house or eating a healthier diet or facing a lot of your emotional baggage, we get overwhelmed by it and scared of it and run away from it the other direction because we think we have to do it all on our own. And in my own journey, it's one of those things where I look back and I think I was so emotionally and physically depleted that I didn't even have a chance to worry. I just got thrown right into it. But I can look back and see where, like, he literally held my hand every teeny tiny little step of the way. And so I just want women and men to remember that you are not doing this alone. And so that in and of itself should take away some of that feeling of overwhelm and of fear, because you're not doing it alone. He's going to walk you through each and every part of it. He's going to equip you. He's going to give you the strength to go through it. He's going to give you the tools to go through it. And just to remember that you don't have to put all that weight on yourself.
Wow. Well, amen to that. And Jenn, again, thank you so much for joining me today on this episode.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, sister friends, that is a wrap for today's episode of She Walks in Truth. Thanks for joining Jenn and I on our chat today. If you would like to get connected with her, her new book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or over on her blog. You can head over to shewalksintruth.com, though, for all those details, as well as subscribe to our weekly email list where you get an encouragement in the Lord. All right, have an amazing week in the Lord. God bless you.
You You've been listening to the She Walks in Truth podcast, filled with encouraging messages and inspiring stories of women living life for Christ. Join the conversation with Carrie and her guests today at shewalksintruth.com.